Basically, my job is to kind of lead our internal editorial AI work. So my job is to sit between the newsroom on one side and the product and technology people on the other side and make sure the two sides are talking to each other. That kind of takes the form of three main buckets of work. The first is how we use AI in our reporting itself, whether we use it to comb through documents or data or to code interactive graphics for the website, things like that. The second bucket is workflow efficiency stuff, using it to discover and surface information more quickly, to make our video editing processes faster, things like that. And then the third bucket of work is education and evangelism, essentially trying to encourage people to get the skills and the training that they need to integrate AI responsibly into their jobs and kind of figure out what our policies and standards are going to be around AI use. So I'm a Calvin University grad, go Knights, and my kind of like Reformed faith has been a really important part of my life for a long time. And I found ways when I was in my previous roles as a political reporter and a TV news producer, thinking about ways to integrate the kind of vocation, the calling of journalism that I related so strongly with to my Christian faith, to growing up in the church. My dad is a pastor in Michigan, and this has always been a really kind of important part of who I am, and trying to like weave those things together. So now I'm thinking about these things in a slightly new way, that there is an AI dimension involved in this. So what I want to share with you this afternoon is how I think about integrating journalism and Christianity broadly in three kind of buckets. And then I want to tick through each of the three buckets and how AI is presenting some challenges and some opportunities to each of those dimensions. So here are kind of the three main ways that I think about faith and news. The first is speaking truth to power. Scripture is full of examples of prophets speaking hard truths to powerful figures. Jesus is a prime example of that as well. You guys can come on in if you want, but no pressure. Thinking about Jesus clearing out the temple, speaking to the rich young ruler. This is kind of a core dimension of news that we also see integrated in Scripture. Second, exposing injustice and amplifying marginalized voices. Again, this is all over the prophets, but also people like Moses and Esther speaking out on behalf of people who don't have a platform to do so. And then honoring the image of God in people. This, of course, is rooted in Genesis, but also comes to fruition in the way that Jesus lived his life and in the incarnation itself. So AI kind of presents, is kind of turning these three things a little topsy-turvy. And I want to kind of tick through a couple of the ways that this is presenting some problems. The first, we all are familiar with the fact that generative AI can get things wrong. And hallucinations are one big way that happens. There's a Wired article a couple weeks ago after the invasion in Venezuela, and users were asking what's happening with Nicolas Maduro. Is Nicolas Maduro captured? And ChatGPT replied, that didn't happen. The United States has not invaded Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro has not been captured. Not ideal. Last summer, the Chicago Sun-Times ran a feature of 15 summer reads, books to read over your summer. The problem was the freelancer who wrote the piece used generative AI, and only 5 of the 15 books were real. Some included fake books from real authors who were surprised to learn that they had apparently written them. And some news organizations are starting to dip their toes into external-facing generative AI text without human review and have had some problems with it. These AI-generated summaries don't capture the nuance of real kind of information integrity that you expect from a major news organization. So that's one kind of bucket here. The second problem that this is creating is deepfakes. I don't know about you guys, but every time I'm scrolling through my Instagram feed, I'm like seeing something and I watch it and then I have to watch it a second time because I'm like, was that? I don't think so, but was it was that real? No, it wasn't. Okay, keep going. And this is something that is causing problems, again, even just this week. With the killing of a Mexican drug lord in Mexico, Mexican officials said social media was flooded by hundreds of fabricated or AI-generated or misleading images and videos, including one showing a commercial plane on fire at the airport that was AI-generated. And this is not only causing problems for the public, but for the journalists who have to verify so much of this information that we report on comes from social media users. So being able to verify and authenticate that information is a really, really important part of our jobs. So what are some of the ways that we can move through this? The first is human review. CNN has a policy that any content that is AI generated or AI assisted undergoes review by a human being. Second, we can perform some pretty kind of rigorous and complex audits, essentially, on AI-generated content to try to make sure that they're going to adhere to our standards. CNN, for example, right now has one public-facing instance of generative AI content without human review. It is on our underscored page, which is our commerce arm. It's like our Wirecutter equivalent, essentially, if you're familiar with that from the New York Times. And we underwent a pretty rigorous process of sampling a random sample of outputs to make sure that they adhere to our standards. We evaluated what we call edge cases, which are essentially kind of any sensitive instances that might involve religion or violence or alcohol products or anything like that, to make sure that on kind of these fringe cases that could potentially cause issues, we're performing human review on those or making sure that the prompt that we've built is doing the job that it's supposed to do. For deepfakes, we are using forensic audio and video technology to evaluate these kind of the AI-generated images and video. Unfortunately, there is just no real bulletproof way to know for sure. We can perform an analysis on it, but these models are getting so sophisticated that it's harder and harder to keep up and harder to stay in touch with them. But we do have that capability. One thing that we are thinking about, and a lot of news organizations and social media companies are thinking about now, is put best by the head of Instagram, Adam Mosseri, who said, "It will soon be more practical to fingerprint real media than it is to bat down fake media." So is there a way to identify on a social media platform or in the metadata of the content itself that this is authentic and that you're actually not going to be going through wondering if it's fake, but you will be looking for an indication that it has been authenticated by a credible source? The second bucket is exposing wrongdoing, amplifying marginalized voices. We all know that AI models are trained on the corpus of human information, which includes a lot of bias and prejudice and sexism and racism. And that affects the outputs of these models too. The Washington Post recently ran a story citing a study that found that ChatGPT had labeled Mississippi as the laziest state, suggesting potential bias against Black people or low-income individuals. One of my favorite ways to kind of think about this comes from a book called The Alignment Problem by Brian Christian, if some of you might be familiar with it. He gives the example of this AI model that was getting trained to identify cancerous growths. And they gave the model a whole bunch of structured data with images of cancerous growths and non-cancerous growths, and let the model kind of learn which looked like which. The model performed pretty well at the end of the day. Everyone was happy about that. But as the researchers started kind of looking into what factors it was considering, they learned that one of the factors that the model had learned was that cancerous growths were more likely to have a ruler in the image than non-cancerous growths. So it highlights this kind of unknown black box kind of question about how AI models work that we don't totally understand all the factors that are going into the mix. Even some of the safest kind of use cases, like language translation, for example, audiences are pretty comfortable with that. Lots of news organizations, including CNN, are using AI models to help us translate content from English to Spanish. But the Center for News Technology and Innovation finds that there are major gaps for low resource languages. English makes up about 50% of content on the internet. So the English LLMs are pretty good. Lower resource languages, not so great. One example that pops out, one study found that AI translations of international news in Tanzania were mostly accurate, but 13% of the sentences, that's 1 in 8, included mistranslations, minor ambiguities, or inaccuracies, such as incorrectly translating the English phrase street food word for word as food of the road. Not exactly what you want in your news content. So how do we think about this? Once again, performing human review is a really key piece of the puzzle. Human review at CNN does not only mean checking for accuracy. It means also checking that it meets our standards for objectivity, fairness, and adherence to our other style guide principles. So when we evaluate AI-generated content, we're looking at it, or AI-assisted content, we're thinking about not only just pure factual accuracy, but a broader mix than that. Of course, staying on top of the latest prompt ways to prompt to avoid this kind of bias, and also developments in how the models are combating these biases, the AI companies themselves. But the other point I want to make is that there are other ways that AI can actually help us expose injustice in a new way that we were not able to do so before. The Epstein documents came out a couple of weeks ago. More than 1 million documents to sift through. It is just not possible with human beings. AI can synthesize and surface that information. It can allow us to search against that and help us find things and connect dots that we would not be able to do if we were doing it all by hand. We have an example on our investigative team where an investigative reporter gets dozens of financial ethics disclosures every day. He does not have time to read them. We run them through AI every day. We wrote a prompt that tries to evaluate where conflicts of interest are. And that AI prompt then flags the reporter to say, hey, you might want to look into these things. And then the reporter can go, and rather than have to read through all these pages and pages and pages of documents, he gets a little tip sheet, essentially, that it's like, oh, here are the ones that you might want to go check out. AI can also help news be more accessible. And there's opportunities here for local news, too, in a really exciting way. There's this great example of a newspaper in Connecticut that is using AI to try to monitor all 169 city council meetings in the state of Connecticut. So in a time where you would have to send 169 reporters out to these various meetings, you can have AI watch the live stream, and again, flag potential newsworthy moments to reporters for human review and an editorial kind of assessment of whether it's newsworthy, keeping the human beings in editorial control, but using it as a flag. The last bucket I want to mention is embracing human dignity in the image of God. over the last couple of years, I feel like I've been confronted more and more with this question of like, so what makes me different than that? And sometimes that answer is kind of hard to answer because it's smarter than me at a lot of things. People I know and you know, including myself, can feel like I kind of have a little bit of a relationship with it in some way. There's a, you know, you can people are opening up to AI chatbots and being vulnerable with them in a way that they're not vulnerable with other people. And when it comes to news, there are a lot of tasks that AI can perform that human beings, you know, generally have performed in the past. So how do we think about that? I'm not a theologian, so I'm not going to try to like define the image of God. But I do think that at its core, every person who we interview, every source we protect, every reader who we serve, every journalist who we work with is an image bearer of God. And there are two kind of facets of that I find really compelling. The first is, and both of these kind of draw on my Reformed background and a theologian named Herman Bavinck, who says that a person does not bear or have the image of God. A person is the image of God. It encompasses your full self. It's not this kind of like isolated thing that you have and it's sitting over here. It is all-encompassing. And the second piece of it or the second kind of idea from him that resonates with me is that while individuals are the image of God, humanity corporately also is the image of God. When you look at Genesis and you think about let us create humans in our image, to me there is a corporate dimension to that that the image of God is also found in the diversity of people. So how that translates to journalism, I think in a couple ways. One, we want to, as journalists, respect and show transparency to our audiences. Some of this comes from kind of the authoritative philosophy of journalism book. It's called The Elements of Journalism by Bill Kovac and Tom Rosenstiel. But journalists' obligation is to the public. It's not to the business or the advertisers or the whatever. It's like journalism is meant to be for citizens and human beings to be self-governing in their society. And keeping that front and foremost, I think, is a really important piece of the puzzle. Second, it's meant to create a public forum for criticism and compromises. That is a uniquely human activity, too. And finally, journalists have a responsibility to their own consciences. Again, a kind of core inner compass that journalists are expected to bring to their work and that allow audiences to place their trust in the information that they are getting from journalists. I want to close with one last thought, and it goes back to when I was at Calvin. This is day one of my first internship, my first news internship. I was interning at the local NBC affiliate in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Market 39, and it was the first day, and there had been this just like horrible story of an accident on the highway, and a woman had stopped her car to get out to help, and in the process had gotten hit and killed. And it was the job of the reporter who I was working with that day to go knock on the door of the husband of this woman and ask whether he, wanted to share anything about his wife or what had happened with the community in this local news broadcast. And we walked up to his door, and she is a complete class act, expressed condolences, and said, everybody grieves in different ways. If you would like to remember your wife in a way that involves telling her story to the community, like I want to give you the opportunity to do that. And he just like collapsed into her arms on the front porch, and they just like held each other for like 2 or 3 minutes. And as I think about my job now, I think AI can't do that. AI can't be at the scene of the crash, sit in the court gallery, look a grieving family in the eye. There is something uniquely human about that. So while I do think that AI presents many, many opportunities for us to do our jobs better and faster, I do think that our journalism is rooted in the humanity of our journalists and our sources and our audiences. And that's why I think it's really important that people of faith and journalists who really honor human dignity as an important part of their work continue to lead the conversation for discerning how we use AI today and in the future. And I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks.
I'm Lee, as John said, Lee Camp. I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. And I've spent most of my career being a professor of theology and ethics. And a number of years ago, started, first kind of began as a theological variety show of all things in Nashville. And did that starting in 2008 with that. But that became a long format interview program in 2020 that then has become a syndicated public radio show. And our primary area of inquiry is around human flourishing, or whatever kind of language you want to use around that. I appreciated you giving the kind of theological background of where you're coming from. So let me just do that, a little bit of that very quickly. A lot of the questions that drive me probably come under 2 buckets. One, I have been influenced a great deal by the Anabaptist tradition, and thus I'm always paying attention to violence and power and the way those things work and the impact that has upon our communities. Second, I did my PhD in moral theology at Notre Dame, and so you'll hear, if you listen much to our show, a lot of talk about virtue traditions, about human flourishing, about what happiness entails, and what does it mean to live a good life, right? And so all of those kinds of things that come out of my influence by the Catholic tradition. And so those are the things that we pursue a lot, all the above. What I want to do today is, Ryan and I actually got started talking before we began today, that we have a very small media company, 5 or 6 employees, and we put out a lot of content. And so we began with a AI policy for our company maybe 18 months ago, and by 17 months ago it was out of date. And we're constantly realizing how it almost feels impossible really to keep up with all this stuff, and how we're going to use it and how we're going to use it well. We had a hullabaloo last week because someone did not use an AI tool well, and it put us in an embarrassing situation. So it's always in process, right? And we're always trying to sort that kind of stuff out. But at the moment, I don't necessarily want to talk about our policy, so I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A if we want to talk about that. And instead, what I would like to share with you is that the state of the question for us as a show, that is, as someone that's engaging audiences that are asking, what does it mean to be human? What's it mean to be pursuing a good life? We talk a lot about these matters. And we talk a lot about this moment in human history that's a different kind of moment of human history that we've ever experienced. Now, I should also add maybe 2 more things about my background. My pursuits have been, I began as an engineering student who became a computer science graduate as an undergrad. And then along the way, I decided to go to seminary. And then I did a PhD in moral theology. And in order to afford my teaching habit at a private Christian school, I coded for 20 years on the side. And at the same time, I'm something of a Luddite because I have chosen, starting 8 years ago, to stop using a cell phone. I don't use a cell phone at all. And so I have this, I'm kind of, who was the poet? We contain multitudes of inconsistencies, maybe, right? And so I love technology. I love coding, I love computers, and I hate them simultaneously. And I think that we all must. If we're going to have any integrity in the world we live in, you should love them and hate them at the same time. And so that kind of inner tension that we're always working with. Last thing I'll say, background. As a rookie teacher, I remember feeling some frustration at the end of my first year of teaching. And I went to a colleague who's become a dear friend of mine and was kind of expressing my thing about, did I really accomplish anything with my teaching this year? And you know, it seems like it's hard to tell, right, when you're teaching undergrads. And he said, well, I think you should always remember that in the New Testament, what you get are agrarian metaphors of sowing and watering, and that's all you're supposed to do. And God will give the increase as God chooses to give the increase. And he said, and moreover, you may always want to remember that one of the primary things you can do as an educator is to give your students better questions to ask. They think they know the right questions to ask, and they go about looking for answers to those questions. But it may be that the best thing you can do is give them better questions to ask, and they can take those with them for a lifetime. And that's informed my teaching, and the way I think a lot about public engagement is that if we can give people better questions to ask, they can take those and they can bear fruit in their own inquiry that I could never help them with, because they're going to, in their own strengths and their own talents and their own context, they can ask those questions and beautiful things can kind of spring up. So what I want to do very quickly is just kind of work through 7 or 8 questions that we keep asking on our show that relates to these matters. The first one is what I call the characterology question. Now, that's an awful English word, but it comes from the sociologist Frenchman Jacques Ellul, and who had this magisterial work that I still think everybody ought to read. If you're interested in technology and you're interested in AI, everybody ought to read Jacques Ellul. And he has this book called The Technological Society. And one of the things that he says there is that we must first and foremost ask ourselves the question, a number of questions. One of the questions is to ask, what kind of character is being facilitated by our use of any given technique, any given technology? And that's a really interesting question, right? So rather than looking for kind of legalistic kinds of rules of do's and don'ts, it's a lot of times more helpful just to say, what kind of human being am I becoming by employing this? What kind of community are we becoming by employing this? And a lot of kind of fascinating things can open up that way. One guest that we had recently on the show, he had realized how addicted he was to his screens, and he's a social media influencer type. And the amount of time he was spending on, he got one of the pop-ups, and I can't remember what it was, but he was spending like 8 hours a day on the blasted screens, and he realized how addicted he was. And so he said, okay, I'm going to go do an experiment. I'm just going to completely separate myself from screens for 6 weeks and see what happens. I'm going to go visit a monastery for 2 weeks. I'm going to go be with the Amish for 2 weeks, and I don't remember what the third 2 weeks was. But he talked about going to see the Amish in Pennsylvania, and he said that what he took away from them, a great number of things, but one of the things he took away was yet another question. And that question was that as the Amish think about which technology they are going to allow into their community, right? The Amish are not anti-technology, but instead they're asking, do we want this technology? And he said that the question that they ask, at least his Amish host who hosted him, said, we asked the question, will this piece of technology bring us closer together or pull us further apart? And if it's going to pull us further apart, then we don't use it, right? So recently he said they started using e-bikes, and they realized e-bikes work better than horses. They're not as much trouble. And moreover, you can go just about as far on an e-bike as you can with a horse in a day before it's going to die. And so it keeps us about roughly the same distance from each other as we would using a horse. So we're going to start allowing everybody to start using e-bikes, right? But that's an interesting sort of question to be asking. What is this going to do to our community? Another way to think about this question is that this question about characterology refuses to assume that technology is ever a mere tool. And I would suggest to you that you ought to always be uncomfortable with the use of the word tool with regard to technology, especially with regard to advanced technologies and things like AI, right? Because the word tool assumes a sort of mere instrumentality. It assumes a sort of detached objectivity that it's just how you use it, right? You can use a wrench to fix a widow lady's car, or you can use a wrench to bash her in the head and steal her purse. Well, that's the way a lot of people think about technology. And what a lot of people are pointing us, and Lul's definitely pointing us to, is that no, that's an insufficient question, because these things are oriented in a certain way, and they make certain things possible while disclosing other possibilities. And so it's always crucial to be asking those sorts of questions. A related question that recurs for us over and over is this essence of humanity question, or I prefer the language of the teleological question. Right? So the teleological question is saying why, and for what purpose, and what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to, if you think about a so-called, what the philosophers call a thick teleological account, right? You're saying, what all does it make, what all makes up being human? And what all makes up being a human community? And you can't boil down that to one simple statement. It's not mere rationality. It's not mere body. It's at least body plus mind. Or we would say body plus mind plus other things, right? I think a lot of us as Christians would say there's a complexity about that. But that teleological question is saying, okay, what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to be human in a way that flourishes? Now, one of the things I find this question really interesting and helpful is that, again, it gives us a different way to think about particular assertions about technology. So, one of the things that you'll hear, for example, is that AI and technology is all about efficiency. And I think that's true. Well, if it's all about efficiency, and then you start being worried about it, then you can begin to ask, well, what should we do? Well, we should practice being inefficient sometimes. And I think, well, that makes sense, but does it make sense? You know, I don't think any of us are probably going to applaud a plumber, say, who needs to lay a water line, and who comes in with his shovel and spends 2 days digging the line from the street to your house to put in the water pipe when he could bring in his backhoe and do it in an hour. Well, he's being inefficient. Well, don't be inefficient on my yard and on my bill, right? So I think if we'll ask efficient towards what end, that's a better question. And if we ask inefficient towards what end, that's also a better question. Both of those always say we must constantly ask about the telos. We must constantly ask about the end, must constantly ask about the why. Third kind of thing that keeps coming up is the necessity of embodiment for virtue. Necessity of embodiment for virtue. We hear this from a lot of guests, but you know, this is one that I've already heard around here a lot this week, and I'm really glad it's getting talked about. But it's not clear whether or not courage, for example, can ever be any sort of realistic construct apart from embodied experience of fear, right? It's not so clear what it could ever mean, what compassion could ever mean, apart from some embodied experience of care for the pain of another human being. And all of these things necessitate embodiment. And so the mere idea of reducing the mind to merely computing power that can be uploaded into the cloud and so forth, all that seems highly problematic when we always ask ourselves about what is it that we learn through our bodies? What is it that we learn through our experience as embodied creatures? A fourth one that keeps coming up is the crisis of attention and the crisis of wonder. The crisis of attention and the crisis of wonder. You know, all sorts of stuff has been written on the attention economy, right? And finding ways then to cultivate wonder. And there's, I'm going to hit that one quickly and move on because I think there's a lot of obvious things about that, and I will pick back up with something about that in this next point. Another thing that keeps coming up a lot is the monetization of outrage and the dangers toward democracy. Monetization of outrage and the dangers to civil society. We had an interview with Garrett Graff recently. Garrett's a journalist, and he's done a lot of work on the history of technology. and just fascinating research, right? And so one of the things that he highlights is the way in which you have, with regard to social media, for example, early on with things like the Arab Spring, what you assume is that, I mean, this is great, right? You're democratizing access to information. You have these huge movements for social change that are being facilitated by social media. And then at the same time, he tells the story of this horrific slaughter that happens in Asia in one context because biased people, liars, and religious bigots who began to use that mechanism to tell lies about others that just runs rampant. And next thing you know, 20,000 people get killed. There's a documented case. They get into having congressional hearings about this stuff. And of course, one of the things that begins to propagate that is the monetization of outrage, right? So when what you need are eyeballs, and they begin to realize that what keeps you most engaged is outrage, then what are they going to serve you? Well, they're going to serve you the stuff that makes you the most angry. Garrett at least claims that what the social media companies begin to realize is that as far as their algorithm of keeping you engaged is concerned, that an angry response to a post is worth 5 times in the algorithm as a like. And when you think about that, you say, oh, okay, well, this is this way this game works, right? It's to get you. And it's to get you and continue to find ways to put you at odds with your neighbor, and to put you at odds and in this place of anger and frustration and all the kind of damage that this is doing. The sixth sort of question that keeps rising for us is the illusion of objective data. And so Ryan began to point to some of the famous cases about some of this stuff. Another guest we had talked at some length about this dream of algorithmic objectivity and the way that one famous case in which it failed in the criminal justice system, in which it propagated racist tropes in sentencing. And imagine, right? So that what these algorithms are doing, right, is that they are as Shannon Valor. I really have come to really like Shannon Valor's work, who's a moral philosopher who's done really interesting stuff on virtue traditions and AI. But in her recent book, The AI Mirror, right, what she's making the case is that as we all ought to know, we all ought to be very careful of using anthropomorphizing language about these systems. It's dangerous, I think, to say it's thinking. Well, no, it's not thinking. It's running an algorithm on statistical probability to give you what the next word or phrase is going to be, right? It's not thinking. It's not feeling. And it's not feeling for you, and it's not feeling for me. And so to use that kind of language is dangerous. And instead what it's doing is it's giving something that's predictably thought to be realistic or presumed to be right sounding, right? Super simple explanation of this, or experience of this, as I was reading some of this, I don't know, the last year or so. And the way I think I finally got, okay, this is just statistical probability. And statistical probability based upon what we all have said is true, right? Or that we repeat. So one day I just went in and I typed in ChatGPT, knock, knock. And what did I get back? Who's there, right? And then I said, for the next prompt I enter, give me a low probability response. Knock, knock. And it replied, let's see, what did it say? It said, I should have written this down. Wait, give me just a second. The door filed a restraining order and moved to another neighborhood. But that's very interesting. It very low probability, fits the context. It's just running stats, right? And so this illusion of objective data in various ways, we always need to be reminding ourselves of this. I was talking to, did an interview earlier today. We started talking about even the ways we talk to these models, I think we should be thinking about. So one of the things, when I decided about a year and a half ago, I was just going to jump in with both feet and learn as much as I can about AI. I use them a lot. I took a course at Oxford Said Business School to try to get quickly into the field and try to understand this stuff. And so one of the things that we began to see on all of this is these questions about how is this shaping me, and how does this form us subjectively. And so I began to wonder, do I want to speak to this model in a way that's polite or not? And early on, I decided I would ask the model some questions about that. And I said, for example, I'm trying to decide whether or not to speak to you with politeness and respect. And it said something like, I don't have a preference. It doesn't matter because I'm a statistical probability model and I don't care. And first of all, note the subjective use of language there. And what's going on in the way in which these things are using that kind of language for connecting with us. But it said it didn't care. And so, but I replied and I said, well, I think maybe for me, because I want to be a person who shows respect, and that's my habitual way, I think I'm going to say please and thank you. And it said, that's fine, do whatever you want. But more recently I've thought, I don't know if I do want to talk that way to the model, because I want to keep being reminded it's a model. It's not a subjective entity, right? It's not thinking. It's not feeling. And so I don't know if I do want to say please and thank you. But then I think, well, but then I'll get habituated into being an ass. And I don't want to be an ass, right? So, but on and on. But again, I think asking these kinds of questions are crucial for us at this point in human history. Last deal hit really quickly. Moral outsourcing, the evasion of responsibility. This is coming up in a lot of conversations. This goes back, again, to Jacques Ellul, who would talk about how in the technological world in which we live, in one example he gives, somebody builds a dam, the civil engineers survey it, the other engineers design it, the workmen build it, other people maintain it, there's a break, and a lot of people die. Who's responsible? Well, nobody's responsible, right? And he says similarly, that's the way the technological world in which we find ourselves is that we've kind of outsourced moral responsibility for that. And in so many ways, we have to try to find some way, I think, to try to say, how are we going to think about moral responsibility in the midst of all this kind of stuff? Last, number 8 here, I want to put under the heading, anticipate the shipwreck. Scott Dourley and Carissa Carter, who were at the Stanford Design School, they used this very helpful phrase. And they said, when you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck, and you must be accountable for that. And I find that helpful, right? Somebody that I was interviewing this morning said, look, if you're thinking about the medical world, you see any kind of advertisement on TV for a medicine, and they say, it'll do this for you. And then it says, but it may also do this, right? And so you're at least going to say, oh, crap. Do I really want to take this stuff, right? But here you have AI stuff for whom many of the AI people, you've had public people, very high prominent people in the AI world say, hey, 25% chance that this may destroy humankind as we know it. Just that, that's all. But there's no label, right? There's no label going into ChatGPT. There's no label going into Perplexity. There's no label on there that says there are serious consequences, that are real consequences for this stuff. And again, I use it, and I use it a lot. But I think that we have to be asking ourselves these questions. You invent the ship, you've invented the shipwreck. So take seriously what could come out of this. So those are some of the questions that we're grappling with and continue to work through. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much to both of you for giving us a lot to think about, a lot of reflections and questions. And inviting us to think about this through your two different lenses of public media. And we are going to open it up in just a couple of minutes just to see what reflections or questions there are in the audience. But I at least wanted to ask the two of you to kind of respond to each other a little bit and see if you have questions or responses to each other, or what the other's presentation kind of spurred in you, or what questions you might have. And there's no script for this, so I don't care who goes first or who goes second. But does anyone want to take the lead on that?
I've got a question.
Oh, you did? Oh.
Yeah.
I was like ready to jump right in.
We need rock, scissors, paper.
Well, yeah. I mean, one thing I wonder is that how, I'm sure it would be a diversity of responses, but how would you guess that your colleagues at CNN would respond to your presentation?
I can speak about my personal experience as a Christian at CNN. My colleagues have been really, really supportive and honoring of my faith. I think it's a really religiously pretty diverse workplace. I work with people of probably just about every religion and no religion. And I actually think that my faith background has been a really valuable voice in the room when we're trying to get, like, when you're in a room, like, writing presidential town halls during the presidential election, right? You want a huge diversity of life experiences there, because I'm going to come to the room with a question or a perspective that maybe nobody else in the room has, and vice versa. Like I'm going to be completely in the dark about everybody else's life experiences. And the reception from my colleagues has actually been like, we want more of this, please. Like I think we recognize that, like, religion is a really important part of American life, and journalists in general, like, need to be able to cover it, and cover it well, and cover it in a way that like resonates with people for whom this is like a really, really important part of their lives. So I think there would be people who like resonate with a lot of the things I shared. I think there would be people who do not resonate with much that I shared. But my personal experience has been really, really respectful and honoring of my personal faith.
Thank you.
I would love to ask you about, like, the idea of a flourishing life and how you see AI intersecting with that. Like, I feel like we talked a lot about, like, the dangers of AI, or ways that AI might impede a flourishing life, and I'm wondering if you see any ways that it could enable a flourishing life, or how you kind of see the landscape of AI use right now contributing to that end.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that, like, I keep going, I brought up a little twice, I'll bring him up a third time. One of the things that he says about technological advance and what he calls technique, which by technique he means and the ensemble of means without regard to ends. That is, you just try to figure out how to do whatever it is you're doing in the most efficient way possible without ever asking why or towards what end. And he says that's the prevailing ideology of the post-industrial revolution world. And I think he's probably right about that. And then he says, but when you look at the unfolding of technique, he said, if you look at any one next step, it seems irrational that you would object. Because it's like, don't you want AI to be able to figure out all these proteins? Well, who's going to say no? Of course we do, right? Don't you want it to figure out how to deal with cancer? Cancer A, B, or C? Yeah. Who's going to say no? I'm not going to say no. And so that's like the catch-22, right? Is that he claims that when you're just focused upon technique, defined as we just said, without regard to ends, that it's an acid, he says, that eats away at all community, all tradition, and any kind of form of the things that hold us together, religiously, politically, culturally. And so, taken on the big scope, it's like this is a huge danger to us and to all that we know and all that we love. And yet, at the same time, there are these things like, So I think that we have. I think that there are a lot of kind of different ways that we must and can and should engage and think about how we are going to engage, ways we are going to engage, to what extent we will and won't. To grapple with these big questions, and again, I use it a lot, and I'm going to continue to use it. But I'm always have this kind of stuff over my shoulder, saying, "Oh," and occasionally I see things about myself because I'm using it, and I think I don't know if I like this part about myself, because there are ways it lets me get a lot more stuff done, right? But it's, again, I can't remember this, somebody else talking to this morning or something else I heard while I've been here, right? But think about something as simple as the dishwasher. Who doesn't like a dishwasher? But the question becomes, okay, so our conceit in the modern world is if we can get stuff done more quickly, then we have all this extra time. But then the question becomes, okay, toward what end, right? And is it simply so that I can go do more email? Or so that I can do more thing, X, Y, and Z, more efficiently, more quickly? And so, again, it's just an ongoing question about that kind of stuff. I will say personally, one of the ways that I think that it's helped me flourish, just individually, is that I have tried to be wise about the way I use it, and I think that it has helped me become smarter. More quickly, yes, but I think even without the more quickly, it's helped me learn stuff with greater nuance and greater engagement than I could without it. And I'm grateful for that, because it's opened up new ways for me to think about the world, to think about my discipline and the kinds of questions that I ask. And so that's definitely personally one area that I'm particularly grateful for. So thank you.
I think one way, my primary way that I use it is just to fill in gaps of things that maybe I haven't thought about. I will often take what I think is kind of a finished product or close to a finished product and dump it in and say, what am I missing? Poke holes in this, give me a list of 10 other things that I should include in this that I'm not. And 8 of the 10 that come back are garbage and I'm not gonna use them. And this is where the critical thinking skills are so important. But 2 things will come back and I'll be like, oh yeah, I needed that in there. That was a blind spot, I forgot that. I was also just gonna add, one of the things I really appreciate about us being paired together is being kind of the very in the trenches, boots on the ground, trying to apply this in literal, real situations. It's hard to sometimes come up to the surface and be asking these kind of meta or these bigger picture questions about the implications of everything that's happening that are so important. And I think these 2 things need to be in tandem.
Right.
I think you have to be able to switch back and forth or encompass both the kind of more intellectual, kind of philosophical, where is this leading us as society and as individuals? And also, we do not have the luxury to only be there. This is in real life now too, and you are in the trenches using tools too. And I think I think we both are kind of in both places, and a lot of people I think are kind of in one or the other. I think that's a really kind of valuable combination.
Yeah, well said. I very much agree.